In this conversation today, I wanted to have a chance to look at terrorism in a more introductory level, and then also the associated work on terrorism that Netanyahu has been involved in over the course of the last 40 or so years. Now, there's a litany of things worth mentioning when it comes to terrorism that are perhaps outside of what would be normal dialogue on a subject like this you might receive from something like the news, which is alarmist and very sensational in a way that's giving you exposure to terrorism as an act rather than necessarily the ideological principles of terrorism, what terrorists actually are doing when they utilize violence in a political way, and then how we can perceive their intentions versus the legality versus their outcomes, and what we can potentially understand about the success and failure of something like terrorism. In general, terrorism tends toward ideological principles, which is to say it's a rather new invention, violence itself not being very new, political violence itself not being very new, but the idea that you can have a politicized, systematized version of an idea that's worth killing other people for to bend them to your will is a rather new idea. Now, the first bombing, as you can see here, was in late 19th century, whereby a Russian Tsar was blown up in a suicide bombing, and this method of violence has become much more mainstream since, say, the 90s, after Syria and Assad popularized the method of suicide bombing throughout the Middle East. But in general, the idea of what we call kamikaze, in a way, has been the more recent phenomena rather than the traditional terrorist or ideological principle violence. So, starting with maybe the why. So this investigation is usually done on a overarching shibboleth, so you can consider that the ambit of a terrorist group is usually a political or a socio-political aim, and you can see from the graph here that mostly you can break them down into religious, nationalist, separatist, and political derived ideologies, and those ideologies is what fuels the violence from a motivational standpoint. The idea that religious terrorism is much more popular now can be borne out in the Middle East mostly, and particularly it's Mohammedan violence versus other Mohammedans or versus Hebrews, and from that we can gather a lot of the signifiers of what terrorists do in terms of actions and then what they want in terms of outcomes. The work that Netanyahu has done since the 80s has been centered around painting a very concrete understanding of what is considered terrorism, particularly Islamic terrorism. He does not, and necessarily I think because of his status as a forefront of the Israeli idea, that there should be a stark consideration between a terrorism and their aims and goals. The forerunner, you might call it, or the presage to terrorism in terms of ideological violence was much more around a very civil and political structure that would have been equivalent to partisans. Now, Carl Schmitt wrote extensively on partisans in the theory of the partisan, and a partisan can be a paramilitary or a militarized civilian who is not designated a troop or a soldier against the enemy. So it's this idea that you're having to participate in asymmetric warfare. Asymmetric warfare is embroiled in the same coalescence of paramilitaries. You have guerrilla fighters, and then partisans, and then now you also have terrorists. And these can all be attributed to this almost underdog mentality, but a less formal representation of a body politic. And so it's this idea that you can be an unofficial army waging an unofficial or illegal, as they like to call it, war. And this idea of legality becomes an important cornerstone of terrorism, and that the principle of terrorism is that it is an illegal version of expressing your political aims through violence. Now, legality is where this becomes quite a tricky subject, so we'll start maybe with just where terrorism is, and as you can see, it's mostly religious terrorism in the mostly religious Middle East and Africa, and then you have much more sectarian or you would say nationalist in countries with high levels of atheism, and then throughout the West is usually Islamic terrorism. The IRA were famous obviously for being terrorists or designated terrorists by the UK government from the Black and Tans all the way through to the 90s, and how they were participants and instigators for lots of bombings against civilian targets, which is obviously very fundamental terrorism. If we are going to consider terrorism as to not be a nebulous topic but an actual concrete outlined version of something proper, it would be representative of what the IRA did, in that they had a political aim, which was the separation of Ireland from the UK, and they had the means and methods being violence against civilian targets until they were able to establish their own government and got their wishes and wills. We can probably say the methods don't necessarily well, they're at least not congruent to an outcome that's you could call successful. I think the political milieu and the environment transitions over the course of decades, and that violence potentially accelerates but then also potentially sets back certain movements in ways that are not always as clear-cut as you would think. So sometimes violence is a very good way of engaging in a political discourse in a way that's alarmist, so you get attention and then you can very quickly get what you want. A coup or a civil war is a great example of this, that if you have an accelerated process you can flip the power structure quite quickly. Terrorism is less fortunate in that it does not always allow you to garner sympathy from who you probably want, and that you're fueling recursive violence in a way that if I'm going to blow you up, you'll send the troops in to shoot me and my civilians. And then we can see that throughout the history of terrorism of the 20th century, because the 20th century more or less was the heyday, golden era of terrorism, because it was functionally useful for garnering both support but also attention. And this is the kind of duality between you want money and support, but then you also want more people to join your cause, which is why these ideologies become very important, because you have to pick one people are willing to die for usually, or at least be arrested and then punished for, because if you don't think a cause is above yourself as a person, above your spiritual level and soul, then you will never participate in this risky disadvantageous behavior. And so this is the idea that you're fighting for a cause, and we get the notion of a freedom fighter, and we get and these sort of topics can also be traced back to things like crusades. We've always been involved in causes higher than oneself, but in this specific, we've never sought out to target innocent non-combatants, civilians, in ways that are very violent until rather recently. Usually you would attack opposition forces or political chiefs or prime ministers, czars, people like that, Kaisers. We can start maybe with a little bit of context from Schmitt, who in his theory of the Partisan says, "We will be speaking of them later, but in general, war remains essentially contained, and the Partisan was outside these defined containments. Indeed, his very being and existence are now defined by his standing outside any containment. The modern Partisan expects neither justice nor mercy from his enemy. He has turned away from the conventional enmity of the contained war and given himself up to an other, the real enmity that rises through terror and counter-terror up to annihilation." And you can see how this would be the presage to what would and what has been terrorism itself. And having such a grandiose overture to terrorism means that you've started a method that's steeped in violence from its very beginnings. There can be non-violent means of turning over and coming to power, but in general, violence has more or less been the mechanism by which most groups and political movements tend to operate for their pursuit of power. So the idea then becomes this polarity of a us versus them, the enemy and the ally in Schmittian terms, and how extreme these two versions are differs depending on the alienation of each category. So an Irishman and a British person are actually not that different in almost every respect, except this one core religious and therefore national ideology and the principle there, versus something like an Israeli and a Palestinian, who are much different from both an ethnic and religious social perspective, but then also, as you can see, just the nationality is unequivocally the one or the other. You cannot be both. It's not these ideas are not mutually inclusive, because of this exclusivity, you have to have what is a solution that only can be brought out through the shedding of blood. There's no other way to reconcile these two things, and Spengler does say this, and I can read just a little bit of what he means, but he says here, everything that proceeds from the innermost soul to become flesh or fleshly creation demands a sacrifice of flesh in return. Ideas that have become blood demand blood. War is the eternal pattern of higher human existence, and countries exist for war's sake. They are signs of readiness for war. And even if a tired and blood-drained humanity desires to do away with war, like the citizens of the classical world during its final centuries, like the Indians and the Chinese of today, it would merely exchange its role of war wager for that of object about and with which others would wage war. And it's very evident that this becomes the case, and you can see it through the tribal conflicts throughout Africa and throughout Asia, that the warlike and the warriors who want power will always wage it against those, particularly civilians. And you have a lot of genocides and holocausts throughout history that have basically rotated on this idea of an us versus them, but a militarized us versus a demilitarized pacifistic them. And it's only going to conclude in one way, which is typically a holocaust or a genocide, which is why the arming of civilians becomes of utmost importance to certain political movements, because they fundamentally understand that the only way to stop massacres is to have an option to fight back, and there's no morality in this. I'm saying there's no good and bad people in this. This is just the way that it works. It's the natural element to violence and war. So once we have that as an idea, then you can start to understand how funding and how ideology are these propellants for violence and conflict. What might start off as a one or two person skirmish and some civilian violence can snowball into large conflicts because of the nature of the ideological differences that are at work here, and that the aggressive and acrimonious way that we begin to operate against each other becomes ever more apparent during these, as you said, ballooning conflicts. Something like the Rwandan genocide snowballed this way, but then also there are wars like in Rhodesia where the native versus the Ugandans and the other communistic forces out there was able to probably garner more attention internationally than was warranted for what would have been an African conflict, and a very parochial African conflict at that. This is why Netanyahu has had such a long career, because he's been able to frame in the Israeli context terrorism as a very active idea, that everything that's violent experienced by Israel and Israelis can be defined as terrorism or terroristic sympathy, or apologists who are engaged in at least align themselves with terrorists. And so you can paint a very vivid picture of an us versus them, and he's done that, and he's managed to be able to run his entire political career off of this idea that he's this expert in terrorism, which you could agree with, and he says there is no international terrorism without the support of sovereign states. So it's this, there is no Palestinian movement without the support of Egypt and Hezbollah and Lebanon and anyone from, say, Iran or wherever it might have been, the support over the years. So the idea that you can have a resistance requires both human resources but also capital and arms, and these things are only in industrial levels capable of being imported and supported by sovereign nations. And so this is his entire framing of this, and which is why he's so engaged with European and American leaders on this topic, is like, why would we care about a regional conflict that has no bearing really on the wider political sphere? It's because once you have the entire region set against you for these reasons, you need allies yourself. And then if you can make small conflicts seem larger and more important than they are, which is what he's been able to do, and by being able to draw in terrorism and terroristic sympathies out of 9/11 and the other instances in Europe where Muslims and Islamists have been bombing civilians, you can maintain what is an allied force against I wouldn't say it's a cooperative Islamic terror cell, but there's this idea that Islamic terrorism is almost a one and the same with all the different arms, rather than it's necessarily these diverse and diffuse groups with all differing aims. They're all fighting for the Quran in a way that makes it seem like a jihad, and therefore we're able to combat against this with this singular idea that it's the rest or the West versus them. And this is what he's been able to do and achieve, and which is why he's maintained power and why he's been so successful. It's also why Israel takes such a harsh stance towards any violence done against it, is because he knows that he's able to react in a way that he can legitimize violence against violence, because he's been able, once again, to frame terrorism in a way that if you're a civilian or a non-combatant, then there is a difference. And that when we can start to construe certain people as it's either innocent but a guilt by association, and then the denomination of what you are is either a non-combatant or a partisan or a terrorist, you can see how there's a scaling effect to the seriousness of the allegation, the charge, and then the response that's commensurate to that in violence from Israel to Palestine can be measured and be drawn out in actuality. This idea is not, like I said, new. And even Napoleon commented that you have to fight like a partisan wherever there are partisans. And this is his exact same mentality, that you have to wage war in the way that they're waging war. It's why America lost in Vietnam, is because they weren't able to engage the guerrilla fighters, the Viet Cong, in a way that was sufficient to actually repel and defeat them. You had to wage an asymmetrical war in which they always had the advantage of, if there's one hiding in the bush somewhere, you never know where and how they'll come out and to fight. The same thing happened in Afghanistan. So these formal large military complexes don't have the means and methods to wage war in an asymmetrical way, because it is so gritty and dirty and not very, you would call it clinical. There's this element to, I don't know who my enemy is, so I either round up everybody or I have to wage very poor and ugly skirmishes against combatants when they pop up, and if they pop up, and then you have protracted wars which don't actually eliminate the threat of the terrorism that was the instigator, and the extinguish of war is almost impossible at that point, because it's an ideological war, and as Spengler has outlined, you can only kill it when there's no more blood to be spilled. So the entire premise has been built on this, and this is why Netanyahu acts in the way that he does. He's doing it rather cleverly, as you can probably tell, that he can frame a lot of the international discourse, and so he'll be reprimanded and there'll be conniptions from the UN on certain actions that he's taken, but there's no real effect for him and his government personally, because of the way he can continually frame the violence done against Israel as terrorism, because it's ideological. It's all ideological, and once you don't have this power struggle over a specific governmental system, it's not a civil war. There's no invasion of the USSR by American forces in a way that's very clear as to understanding what the goal is. This is, we have land that you want and you have land that we want, and there's no way for us to reconcile this until we're both either gone or there's one in place of the other. And this is why it becomes so extreme, is because it comes life and death, and the winner will always be the one who's going to continue to fight until they win. And this is why this conflict could be dragged out for hundreds of years. because there is no winner until the last man standing is no longer standing, and that the one party has been able to triumph over the other capitulated party. And he's also rather good at putting up, I would say, maybe non-negotiable terms. So Netanyahu has this consistent aim to negotiate and broker for legitimate peace. In his way, this is what he's phrased it as. There has to be a negotiable version for peace. It's just he already intuitively knows that it won't be accepted on the grounds that they want it. So the idea that the Palestinian representatives will ever say yes to what his demands would be is non-existent. And he knows this. He's smart enough to know this. And it's how he can continue to operate on the same methods that he does. So, as I say, it is fairly clever. It's a great way to interact on a global political scale, to push and design means which are able to obtain more territory for Israel versus the loss of territory for the Palestinian territory. The last few points I think it's important to probably discuss is on the lawfulness category here, because I don't consider lawfulness to be very good nomenclature when it comes to terrorism. The definition of lawfulness is obviously to a degree arbitrary, and arbitrary as in it's arbitered by a power, a sovereign, and that you've got this dictate which is moot to a certain degree. From this we can then say that lawfulness loses its meaning when almost all violence is outlawed to any degree, and that assault can be me yelling in someone's face. That could be considered verbal assault and it's a criminal offense. There's a lot of cases of people yelling in people's faces about political and ideological things, so that can start to constitute terrorism, because if it's considered violence in the way that I'm trying to coerce or coax people into certain actions and beliefs around my own political motives against theirs, then this is how you start to get that slippery slope idea of what terrorism starts to mean, and which is why it's such a nebulous term when it's applied. You can almost say anything is terrorism once perceived violence is instigated, and which is why I don't like it when it's included in these definitions, because it just becomes such a useless and it's almost apocryphal from previous, as I said before, partisanship and the illegality of war. Who can be considered a combatant versus a non-combatant, which is much more clear. If you've picked up a gun, regardless of your uniform, you enter the realm of kill or be killed, versus a terrorist who is always a civilian until they take the bomb vest on. And this is the difficulty against fighting it, but it's also the difficulty against using law as this signifier between a terrorist and a freedom fighter, or a terrorist and just a political active, or an anarchist and the political version of an anarchist versus the bombing and the C4 enthusiast. I think that's probably a good denouement here, and to say that the understanding fundamentally of how to frame terrorism is very, very useful if you are, like Israel is, in a state which is comprised of one certain ideological principle. The West doesn't have this. Democracy can only really be fought against other versions of political ideas. We're not very religious anymore in the West, so there can't be these religious conflicts anymore to any real degree. No one cares enough about religion to die for it. People will online will make obviously a lot of jokes and references to things like crusades, but there are no real interests, and men are not going to go to war for Christ in that way anymore. Whereas it is that way for both Israelis, Hebrews, and Muslims. They will go to war for their religion, and that's why you can have these wars, ideological ones, and why you see so many of these religious terrorists, is because they are just willing to die for it. It's something that they care about enough, and the only real violence here done by Western people against one another will be in the form of words, or potentially state conflicts if it ever comes to that, but I very much doubt it. So the rise and fall of Caesars will be a bloodied affair, but it won't have any terroristic implications. There won't be Trumpers going around blowing up vans of Kamala Harris supporters, because it's not something anyone considers worth dying for. They really want their candidate to win, but they're not willing to do much more than maybe a scuffle, or I know there will be lone wolves willing to do certain things, but the idea of a terrorism as itself has to be a more organized cell, usually monitored by either the FBI or the CIA, right? So the entire idea has to be a bit more not formulaic, but at least formalized in that way. And that's why it's important to understand terrorism from this aspect, that the only people who will be terrorists for the next 100 years will be these mostly Muslim and mostly African ideological separatists and sectarians.